Welcome to Timeless with Vivek Nittoor. Our guest today is Arvind Sanger. Arvind Sanger founded Geosphere Capital, a global long short fund manager investing in natural resources, industrial, and Indian equities in 2007. Between 2002 and 2007, he was a portfolio manager at SAC Capital, investing in a similar fashion. Prior to his tenure at SAC, he had a 15-year career as a top ranked sell side oil services and equipment analyst at a number of firms, including Deutsche Bank, DLJ, among others. Arvind is on the board of the Alexander Hamilton Society, Pratham USA, and Pratham Education Foundation in India. Arvind earned a BTech in chemical engineering from IIT Bombay in 1984 and MBA from Tulane University in 1987. Arvind and I are from the same hostel at IIT Bombay, but we have not known each other before because he graduated 8 years before I did. Many of Arvind's interviews on CNBC and other channels tend to focus on short term market issues, but the focus of these timeless series of interviews is to focus on long term questions so that these interviews are relevant and interesting even 50 or 100 years later. Hi, Arvind. Welcome to this program. It's great to see you.
Hi, Vivek. Good to see you too.
Arvind, how have your memories of H6 and IIT Bombay been?
Well, first of all, I must admit it's been a long time, but there are a lot of vivid memories. It was a memorable phase of my life, and some of my closest friends continue to be people that I spent 5 years, because ours was a 5 year batch, 5 years within IIT Bombay and at H6. And some of my closest friends happen to be H6 batchmates of mine. So, my memories, if you ask me, there are many distinct memories that stick out in my mind. I'm not sure which ones would be most memorable, whether it would be organizing EGBM boycott in our freshman year to make sure that the fans were distributed equitably, and getting hauled up by one of the seniors and threatened for a freshie daring to speak up, or it be some of the uh, political kind of involvement that I had, or bunking classes and playing bridge in the common room, or all of these different experiences. Uh, uh, you know, the water fights and other fights in the wing, and just general CAC sessions late at night, all-nighters with the chai served in the canteen. There's so many memories, and obviously, I had some responsibilities: LitSec at the hostel, LitSec at the institute level, GS Cult at the institute level, and some memories about that, which is not necessarily all H6, but H6 and beyond in the experience at IIT.
Arvind, many of your friends from H6 remember your strong interest in debates, your leadership skills, and the clarity that you had very early on in life that you had to move away from chemical engineering. Another incident that they tend to remember a lot is the incident that you just alluded to. It is managing to get fans for the Kadda wing at H6. How would you recollect that episode today? I see a connection between that episode and your current profession of predicting and betting on a particular economic outcome. So, how did you manage to get fans for the Kadda wing at H6?
So the story goes like this: that there were no fans in H6 when we got there in 1979. About uh, and these fans had been ordered by the institute for all the hostels, and they started coming. So we got there, let's say, in June of 79. In I think about 3 months after we had been there, after the freshie ragging period was over, and we'd had the freshie event to celebrate that. After that was all over, A couple of months later, I'm guessing, I don't remember the month, but sometime in October, November, maybe the fans arrived in the hostel, or the fans announcement came that the fans were coming. So there was a GBM held, general body meeting, to vote on how the fans would be distributed. And the general assumption was that the seniors would get the fans first because they'd waited the longest, which was a valid point. They'd spent 3 or 4 years without any fans, 4 years for the seniors, and they would get the fans first. Now ours was a very large batch. Ours was the largest batch in a hostel at that time. We were about 85 strong. So we had a pretty strong sway. So when they had the GBM, we decided, one of my friends, Sunil Chaudhary, Chodu, and I kind of were the gang leaders of this, that we would vote for fans to be allocated to freshies because we were on the ground floor, and that's where the worst mosquito problem was. We had a big mosquito problem in the hostel, which I'm sure existed even after the fans came and after we graduated. So the fans didn't magically solve it, but they were going to help a little bit. So we tried to lobby for that, but the seniors would have none of it. So we walked out of the GBM. And by us walking out of the GBM or the EGBM, Extraordinary General Body Meeting, there was no quorum for the Extraordinary General Body Meeting because they needed, I forget what the rules were, but they needed a certain number of students to be present to be a valid EGBM. And so by us walking out, we kind of stymied the effort to make that decision, blessed by the student body of the hostel. Later on, we were called by one of the seniors, Dave, to his room, and while he was, with the lights turned on, and he and a couple of other seniors threatened us that they would rag all the freshies all over again if we tried to act too big for our boots. But we finally did manage to persuade them that while there were seniors who deserved it, at least the Khadda wing, if not the entire freshman. The compromise was that the Khadda wing, which, as you well know, is one wing which was kind of at a almost underground, not quite underground, but at a much lower level, and had the worst mosquito problem, would get the fans, while the rest of the fans did go to the seniors. Now, remember, the fans were coming every year. There were new fans. I don't know why the resources were that limited, but they were. And so in that first year, we were able to at least get some of the fans allocated to Khadda wing, and then the rest over the years. I think in the next year itself, everybody got fans in the whole hostel. So this was a temporary problem for which we had this little mutiny organized by Chodu and me.
That's a very fascinating story, Arvind, because I never imagined that there was a time in H6 where there were no fans in the rooms. So this is completely new information for me. Would you also recollect the issue of grape wine that yourself and your friend restarted in H6?
I frankly don't remember what exactly happened in the issue, but we did revive it when I was LitSec Grapevine, and that was a publication. I don't know if it outlived our time, whether it was there during your time or not. But we did revive it, and I think it was, one of my prouder accomplishments is to be able to revive it. But I don't recollect, what all we published in it and how it did. But I do remember that it thrived during the years that I was there, subsequent to that revival.
That's nice to hear. Would you have any specific memories of being General Secretary, Cultural Affairs at the Institute?
Well, I do have a lot of memories and a lot of mixed memories because it was a time of flux. There were a lot of controversy about we had this whole concern that there were outsiders coming in and people from IIT felt left out, and there was very much ongoing tension between what was then two groups, the Suds and the Ghats, and the view was at that time that this was a very much a Sud festival. And it didn't appeal to the broader community, including a lot of the local Maharashtrians, who I guess in that term we were politically incorrect, and it was called Ghats. So I did introduce some events during the year SGS Cult, which were held specifically in Marathi to try to make it more inclusive. But I think these cultural challenges, as we are seeing today in the U.S. with a lot of things going on with Black Lives Matter, these cultural challenges are ever present. And as a leader, I had to, as GS Cult, I had to deal with my share of bouquets and brickbats. And the reality is, as a leader, you get more brickbats than bouquets, and that's the nature of leadership. But my experience there was actually very important in teaching me how to deal with uh, differing constituencies and recognizing, how to compromise, how to bring in people from other hostels. Because my experience before going to, H6 was a very close-knit community, and being the furthest hostel, we were kind of a little bit, we wore a chip on our shoulder of being outsiders and being, kind of different. And being at an institute level position required you to overcome those kind of, that mindset, and overcoming that mindset, and going as a lit sec first on an institute level, and then general secretary, was helpful in my thinking about things in a broader, uh, classmates and the whole IIT concept, rather than the H6 concept, which was very deeply embedded. I'm not sure how different it was in your time, but in our time, clearly, H6 was kind of, way out there in the distance. And, kind of that Chichoria movie makes it sound like H4 was the outsiders, but really the real outsiders were H6.
That's interesting to hear, Arvind. How were your experiences during your MBA at Tulane University?
My experience at Tulane were interesting in two regards. It was obviously my first time in the U.S., so I was dealing with the cultural challenges of living in a uh, different environment completely, interacting with people of different cultures. There were a lot of foreign students, and I obviously interacted with them, and there were also uh, living on my own, negotiating the conversion ratio of everything that I did, having to earn my way through college, because at MBA, people who came for masters had a much in engineering, MS had a much easier time in terms of the financial aid covered both the tuition and the living expenses. At MBA, I was just given, the reason I went to Tulane is I got a scholarship paying for my full MBA, which MBAs normally don't offer foreign students. But I had to work jobs to earn living expenses, which was which I found challenging, and I found interesting, and I enjoyed it. But it was a challenge, and dealing with and doing academics at the same time. The reality was, academically, uh, Tulane was a lot less challenging than IIT in terms of the intensity of the competition. But I think more interesting for me is it was much more natural. Finance and economics was my calling, and engineering always felt like swimming upstream, and doing finance and economics felt so much more intellectually. I felt I was right there, and I really enjoyed it from an academic experience. My academic experience at IIT was not the greatest. My extracurriculars were my memorable parts of my experience at IIT. My academic experience and my extracurricular, all the other things that I did, were both very fulfilling at Tulane. So in that sense, it was good to find that I found my academic kind of home when I did economics and finance.
Arvind, did your interest in economics and finance originate while at Tulane, or did it originate even when you were an IIT student?
Actually, it originated before IIT. So when I was in high school, I was at St. Mary's High School in Baikala. In 11th standard, we had to choose whether we wanted to do uh, engineering or we wanted to do commerce. Uh, and those were kind of, if I remember, the two, science, I shouldn't say engineering, science, uh, or we wanted to science or economic or commerce. And I was destined for science because the assumption was that if you were a smart kid, top of your class, you went into science because everybody middle class growing up at that time, either if you were smart, you either became an engineer or you became a doctor. So I was destined for that. But my favorite subject, even though I didn't take commerce, my favorite subject, even in 10th, I had taken economics and I loved it. So in 11th, I switched out of biology and took economics. And then we had this strange period because our 10 plus 2 was just introduced during our time. I did my ICSE 10 standard in 75, and 10 plus 2 was just introduced. So I did my 11th in high school and my 12th in college. And when I was choosing a college, I had an interesting dilemma because I wanted to go to a college uh, which offered science but allowed you to drop biology and take economics. So I chose Elphinstone College because Elfie allowed me to do both. So my interest in economics predated IIT. It was my favorite subject. In fact, I told my father, and my father was a strong personality, that I wanted to do commerce, and he dismissed it as saying, "You're crazy. You will never earn a living. You have to do engineering." He was an engineer from BITS Pilani, so it was his ambition. And I kind of fell into it that I did engineering, but my interest in economics never went away. And even in IIT, my favorite subjects were either economics or literature, not the engineering subjects. So I was, as I like to say, an accidental engineer.
It is amazing to learn that your interest in economics actually originated during your school days. In fact, one of the recent developments from IIT Bombay is that they have an undergraduate 4-year economics program. So, would you have
That's right.
opted for such a program if it was offered during your time?
Absolutely. In fact, I've talked to the director, and I've told the previous director of IIT, I had this discussion that it was good that they were offering, or they offer in majors and minors, and there's a lot of options available where undergraduates have a lot more flexibility than they did in our time. And I've been very strongly supportive, and I've talked with the administration of the fact that what distinguishes the top universities in the US, and it's funny that you say that. My son is an undergraduate at MIT, and one of the things I've been strongly he wanted to be an engineer. I never pushed him in that direction because I felt economics was an important field, but I didn't want to repeat my father's thing of forcing economics down his throat. And he is now realizing after completing 2 years that although he's in computer science and he's doing very well, that he wants to broaden his horizon to do more things. And in uh, economics, he finds too quantity not enough, but in public speaking or in presentation or even in things like philosophy. So I think these are things that IIT didn't offer much of, and I think IIT has tried to improve its offering. And if it's modeled after the MITs and the other top engineering colleges that are top ranked in the world, then what distinguishes them is that ability to do more than just be narrowly focused on engineering subjects, and to have that broader perspective and to come out with that broader experience.
So, Arvind, it's great to hear about your son and also about the academic flexibility that many universities offer. How did you feel when you were awarded the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Tulane University?
Well, there's a story behind it. So I was asked to speak at they have a commencement ceremony, which is a big one, what we call convocation in in India. There's one in May or June when most of the class are graduating, but they have a smaller one in December when there are some students who are on a on off schedule who are graduating. So in December of 1999, I was invited to speak to the commencement students and also to receive the award for the distinguished alumnus. So it was a very unique experience because I believe I was the first Indian student who was both a commencement speaker and receiver of the distinguished alumnus. I don't know if I was the first foreign student, because there were foreign students, but I think the Indians were the kind of usually the top of the class in that. So I think I was probably the first foreign student and the first Indian student to receive that award and to be the commencement speaker at a convocation for students at the business school. So not the whole university, but the business school. So it was a very good experience, and I still remember my talking to them about thinking globally because the world was going to go much more global, and to realize, and this was a university which is not necessarily at the top of the either global or U.S. rankings, but I feel proud that my words then were prophetic and lasted through time, right? Because a lot of the commencement speeches can be very short term, but for MBAs, you try to give them something that will help them in their career. And I think I may have given some advice that hopefully they found helpful.
Arvind, which professors and mentors influenced you the most during your journey?
Well, I mean, I think at IIT, I won't honestly say that there were Dipan Ghosh as a physics professor was very brilliant, and I enjoyed his class a lot. He stands out in my mind. We always had this one famous professor that everybody was scared of, Professor M.S. Kamath, who taught us, an electrical engineering course that all of us had to take, which was a tough course. But I didn't really, I went and did it, and I did badly, but I passed, and that was all I can say. Those were not the kind of influences. So I would have to say it would have to come back to economics or literature, which were my passions. So my professor of microeconomics at uh, uh, at Tulane changed my view of economics. Although I learned economics for years, right, since 10th standard, 11th standard, 12th standard, and IIT, I did economics also. But what he did was the way he presented it, and it was interesting. He's not a famous professor, but he's the son of a very famous professor. His name was David Friedman, and he is the son of Milton Friedman, who is one of the biggest names in the economics profession in the US, and a Nobel Prize winner in economics. But he taught it in such a brilliantly simple way that I had that aha moment of that made my way of thinking about the world clarified in a way that I knew economics was a way to understand commerce and business, but it made it in a way to understand life and to understand human behavior in an economic framework much clearer. Because economics is not just about dollars and cents or rupees and paisa. It is also about human behavior and interaction and what drives it. And I found that to be a great influence. And then I had some, in high school in St. Mary's, we had a professor, we had a teacher, Mr. Dyer, who was an Anglo-Indian gentleman who was also principal for a couple of years, who taught us English literature, and also taught us a lot about values of honesty and and kind of putting our best effort. And that was a very strong influence for me in terms of being both as a role model and passion for Shakespeare and for the language and all of that, which I found to be some of my one of my most powerful influences in my high school career.
Arvind, with the onset of the fourth industrial revolution, many industries are expected to get disrupted. Which sectors would you expect major disruption in the next 5 years? And which sectors would you expect major disruptions in the next 10 years? How have these inevitable disruptions impacted your investment strategy? And a follow up question is, which stock market trends are likely to remain over the next 5 to 10 years? And what has your strategy been to deal with the lows of the stock market and the systemic crises like the one in 2008?
That's a lot of questions, and that's a lot of questions which cover a lot of different things. So I'll try to answer them. Hopefully, I can remember all the questions. But you ask about disruptions. So I think it was uh, Bill Gates who said that underestimate the impact of change. We overestimate the impact of change in the short term, and we underestimate the impact of change in the long term. And that, I think, is something that I try to keep in mind at the back of my head. So when you talk about next 5 years, I'm not sure which disruptions will be powerful in the next 5 years, because I think disruptions take a lot longer to play out than we think. But if you ask me 10 years or beyond, I think there are some powerful forces. And I actually have to learn from people like my son, who is studying computer science, and he's doing AI and machine learning, and discuss with people like him, and obviously with people with a lot more work experience, to understand some of these disruptions, because these disruptions are going to come from outside my area of expertise, the engineering that I learned, chemical engineering, or the things that I invested in because I grew up as an energy focused analyst. And one of the areas that people talk about getting disrupted is energy and oil and gas. And one of the things that I keep in mind is, in the investment world, and I'm tying this together to your second part of your question, I remember people think that this disruption is going to happen much faster. And 4 years back, to understand this disruption better, and because I was interested, and because I was blown away by its capabilities, I bought a Tesla. And I drive a Tesla for the last 4 years, and the car is amazing to drive. And so I can see how, uh, you know, the disruption in energy, which is going to come from the clean energy efforts. I don't have a solar roof, but I know that solar costs have fallen dramatically, and solar is competitive. So for solar or any of the other technologies to work uh, on a massive scale, what you need, uh, and I look at that because I look at the power companies, and clearly one of the technologies that is going away, which I've invested in the past, is coal. Coal, clearly from a CO2 emissions, is a terrible thing for the environment, and coal is going to be replaced. But coal is the bedrock of power generation all over the world. And one of the things that is going to happen is that transition fuel is natural gas, which is much less than half the CO2 emissions and more energy efficient. And that is happening, but the disruption is going to happen to solar and wind and renewables. The problem with wind and solar and renewables is that they don't, solar you can only generate during the day when it's not cloudy, wind only when the wind is blowing. And there are times when you can have overabundance of wind and solar, and there are times when you have too little. So what you need is energy storage. So where the Tesla comes in and the car technology, and where they marry together, is eventually one of the key challenges to solve for renewable energy. And renewable energy, I think, is going to come, whether it's for transportation or it's for power generation. The two main uses of energy are transportation and power generation. I would say that the storage problem will have to be solved. And the storage problem is not that easily solved. A few years back, I was on a holiday in Chile, in South America, and we were at this elevation of 8,000 feet, one of the prettiest, most unusual places on earth I've been to, called the Atacama Desert. The Atacama Desert happens to be one of the largest sources of lithium in the world. And we were going to these beautiful kind of hikes, and we would come across these little lakes on which there would be these pink flamingos, one of the most unusual sights on earth. It's one of the prettiest places on earth, Atacama. And those pink flamingos and those watering holes are going to be destroyed, drained as a result of the lithium mining. So the idea that we are going to move from one source of energy to another with no side effects, and it's some kind of panacea, is not true. If you look at cobalt, which is another thing used in battery technology, over half the cobalt, or about half the cobalt resources in the world, lie in the Congo, which There's horrible human rights trafficking and violation and kids working that happens to mine that cobalt. And 90% of that mined cobalt goes to China to be processed, to be then sold to everybody else. So if we think that being dependent on Saudi Arabia and being dependent on the Middle East and being dependent on all that for energy is a problem, I think that, so when I come back to this battery technology, I'm not sure if we are not jumping from the frying pan into the fire in terms of renewables, what the solution. So I think the disruption will take a lot longer. And one of the more interesting discussions I had with the head of the, I forget what the department is called at the MIT, but it's kind of the alternative energy department, who's a professor, who's a brilliant man and, professor with a background in engineering, in I forget mechanical engineering, whatever, but he heads that department. And we had this discussion about a year back, and he believes, and there are other incredible people who believe that the solution might actually go back to hydrogen fuel cells. I think that therefore the disruption that will happen, whether it'll be hydrogen fuel cells or it will be battery technology like the ones pioneered by Tesla. Solar costs have come down a lot. Solar energy is cheaper, but you get this grid disruption or grid imbalance that'll have to be solved with storage. So all of these are coming, but I think it will be one of the disruptors long term. Which way it will go is not clear yet. The other disruption obviously is going to be AI and machine learning. And again, I was talking to a professor, Professor Tenenbaum, who is one of the brilliant minds in the field of AI. And one of the things that he said, and again, he's an MIT professor that I met at a talk. One of the things that he said is that he's one of the leading researchers on cognitive AI. And he said we are decades, not years, decades away from computers having the cognitive capability of a 2-year-old child. Decades away from that. So when people think about things like that, those are long away. But my Tesla has a self-driving function. I've used that, but I use that and it's not foolproof. But can I see over time, AI being used for kind of self-driving for trucks on highways and for certain technologies? That may be a decade away. Again, not 5 years away. That may be a decade away. Repetitive functions, jobs. We've already seen on Wall Street trading much more computerized. Even in my business of managing money, the quant funds are disrupting the business in a way that humans they're much more able to find correlate relationships and replace humans and do it more efficiently. The more short-term trading and finding inefficiencies in the market. So I think a lot of professions, from my business, hedge fund investing in ways that we don't see yet, to drivers, car drivers, and whatever, those disruptions are coming. Energy will come long term, but I think it'll take a little longer, but it is coming. So I think there are many mega forces, but I remain optimistic that we're not going to sit all at home with no jobs because computers are going to replace everything that we do. So I don't know if I answered both parts of your question, investment but from an investment standpoint, therefore, energy sector has suffered because of a lot of the disruption that you talked about, 2008 demand collapse, COVID demand collapse, but in between, investors are underpricing the value of assets in the ground because they think that they're going to be obsoleted in 5 years because something is going to come along. I think that's a mistake, but I think the market is proceeding under that assumption. And therefore, that's creating investment headwinds. My belief is I'm not willing to give up on that yet. But obviously, as an investor, if I want to be investing for the next 10, 20 years, I have to look at a broader group of things. Alternative energy has been a tough place to make money because a lot of the Chinese companies that bankrupted a lot of the Western companies and themselves went bankrupt in solar and wind have disrupted that market from an investment standpoint. So it's always a challenge that we have to overcome to find ways to invest in a market which is being either perceived to be disrupted or being disrupted. And as far as these global kind of events that happen ever so often, whether it is uh, the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, I'm sorry, 2008 and 9, or it be the current COVID-induced global economic meltdown that we saw earlier this year. I think these are things that we are realizing that we are in a pretty unique world where the central bankers have started printing money since 2008, and in some cases have never stopped. Japan has never stopped. ECB in Europe has not stopped. The Fed in the US tried to stop and then now is back again. So we live in historically unforeseen times where and one of the lessons I learned in 2009, 10, 11, which I didn't realize fully, is that because these central bankers are printing money, markets are going to be distorted and valuations are going to be distorted. And we have to keep that in mind while investing for the short term, but keeping that risk in mind in the long term, that these distortions will eventually end. When, we don't know, because this has been going on for so long. But in the meantime, as an investor, one has to remain cognizant of that. And I think we have to keep lessons of history in mind, because one of the lessons of history is if you go back after World War II, when a lot of the countries in the West emerged from World War II with huge amounts of debt, the way that the debt was paid down by governments is by keeping borrowing costs artificially low and growing out of your debt. What does that mean? That means that if the governments borrow at whatever market interest rates, the central bankers kept buying government debt and kept debt cost, borrowing costs low, and the savers who invested in government bonds were the ones who got screwed. Their savings were channeled to buy for the government to be able to borrow at low rates to pay away their debts. What is coming, I think, after COVID is likely to be another round of, it's being called yield curve control, whereby the central banks will sit on long-term interest rates. Interest rates are zero or close to zero or negative in much of the Western world and Japan. And inflation will be higher than that, but they will try to sit on interest rates. And as a saver, as an investor, you have to keep in mind that you have to invest so that you're not seeing your wealth destroyed because the government is stealing from you to pay down its debts. So therefore, that's one investment thesis that I think is very important that we have to keep in mind in the next few years, and invest either in hard assets like real estate or gold, or more, or better still, in assets which can generate better than the cost of inflation and not be stymied by the governments and the central bankers trying to keep interest rates under control.
So, do you anticipate a low interest rate situation in most of the Western world in Japan post COVID, as you just mentioned?
Yes, I think we are going to continue to see low interest rates for a long time, because I think that U.S. is talking about another large financial package. I don't think this COVID situation is going away in a hurry, as we're already seeing it happen. So governments are running out in most Western economies. Unfortunately, for countries like India, they don't have, and other emerging markets, they don't have the flexibility to spend unlimited amounts. But for the Western countries, it seems like they can spend unlimited amounts and let the central bankers print the money and then later on deal with the problem. And raising taxes, which can be part of the solution, which will be part of the solution, but they can't raise taxes too much because the economic recovery will be fragile. So I think, yes, low interest rates will be with us for a while.
Arvind, do you get an intellectual thrill by identifying an investment opportunity or a bet? How do you decide to take a bet on a particular outcome in your business? And how much time does formulation of a bet take? Is this process driven primarily by computational models or your intuition or a combination of both?
I would say computational models are the least important in investment decision making. You have to identify, for me, there are two or three things that drive an investment decision and identifying a theme or a trend. One is identifying a mega theme, right? So there was one mega theme I personally invested in real estate counting on, which is, I had an economist about a decade back mention this theme, and I thought it was a brilliant theme, which is that you will see as global population, certainly in the developed world, has stopped growing in terms of new births is stopped growing. It's at a flat or lower rate. The reason that the population in the Western world, to the extent that it's growing, if at all, is because people are living longer. So as people live longer, but the birth rates stop rising, you would see the repopulation of the cities versus what was a trend in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was the repopulation of the suburbs. And as people live longer and they don't want to deal with houses and they prefer to live in an apartment and live in a city, you would see a repopulation of cities and you would see more apartment living. And we've seen this mega trend play out, not so much in developing countries like India, but in developed countries like the US and Western Europe. You've seen a revival of city living, not just amongst youngsters, but amongst senior citizens. I know a lot of friends of mine who have, their kids have moved out and they become empty nesters. They were living in Westchester or Greenwich, suburbs of New York, or uh, uh, and then when the kids went away and the kids came back after college and they wanted to work in New York City and the parents wanted to be close by and they didn't want to deal with living in a large house, they moved to the city, and you've seen that. So that's a mega trend that's been going on now. COVID and post-COVID, one of the other things that drove that trend was increased safety in cities, and I worry about some of the things that are going on right now, whether those trends will reverse. But that was a mega trend. That was a great theme to identify. Uh, but we're talking about this, new energy theme, or whether we're talking about an AI theme. I think understanding some of these mega trends and being able to identify them is important. We don't often get many of these mega trends. Then there are always mini trends that you identify, that are going on that could drive. So, post COVID, there's going to be mini trend. Is there going to be more spending on healthcare? Do you buy companies that are pharmaceutical companies, or do you buy companies that are in the hospital business, or do you buy companies in the medical insurance business in India, because medical insurance was non-existent and now there's going to be more of a recognition of the need for that? Or do you buy more companies that provide lab testing services? But which part of the healthcare? But the healthcare spending, I think, if you talk about a 5-year trend, will be around. So I think recognizing those themes is important. Then identifying the companies that can play in those themes and understanding which managements. This is a very important part, right? It's a people business. Success is not driven by markets. Success is driven by people. And understanding which managements have the capability, the wherewithal, the honesty, the flexibility to be able to adapt to whatever surprises will come their way and to be able to deliver. Which companies are well positioned because of the investments that they made before, either because of luck or because of foresight. I don't care how it got there, but which companies are positioned to be able to take advantage of those trends. I don't care whether the companies got there because of luck or because of their own effort, but identifying which companies have invested to position themselves to take advantage of this opportunity. So, it's the mega trend, it is the management, the leadership, the founder, whatever people, and it's the company and how it has, either by luck or by effort, invested in the right things to be positioned for this trend and for this opportunity. Those are the most important things. And last comes the financial model, whether it's a dividend discount model or just a simple PE-based approach or whatever. What is the growth rate? What is the growth rate of this business? what is the valuation of the company? Is this something that I'm early on? Or let's take Tesla as an example, right? I'll use an extreme example. Tesla, in my opinion, is hugely undervalued. I mean, overvalued, sorry. Tesla is hugely overvalued. They may be at the confluence of two trends, one of which is self-driving, and the other is, you know, uh, environmentally friendly solution, whether it's an electric car or in the future, maybe, hydrogen fuel cells might displace that. But that at the confluence of those trends, but I believe that, today being valued at whatever 40 plus billion, the most valuable auto company in the world, even though it's sells a pittance of the cars that a Toyota or some of the other companies sells, is way ahead of itself, even if Elon Musk is a visionary. So therefore, at the end, you have to also recognize that is it a trend that you're following the herd and everybody's already there, or are you identifying a trend that the valuation doesn't already reflect all of the good news in terms of what you're seeing?
Your comment about Tesla being overvalued ties in very well with your earlier comment about disruption cycles taking much longer than expected. So it's a kind of a consistent theme that I'm actually seeing during this discussion, Arvind. So how would you describe your experience before SAC Capital? Could you please share some key events from that phase of your life? Could you also please briefly describe your experience of selling computers at HCL between IIT Bombay and Tulane University?
Sure. So, when I graduated from Tulane, I got a job at an investment bank in New Orleans called Howard Weil. Actually, I worked for them in my summer between my first and second year, and my entire second year, and then I joined them full time in the equity research department, working in under the senior analyst covering the oil field service and equipment industry. So that's how I lucked into my profession that I did. Uh, and I can some other time tell you the story of how my first job and how I was a pioneer, because I was the first Indian ever hired by that firm, and after me every year they hired an Indian from Tulane Business School. So I was kind of a path breaker. I'll tell you that story some other time. But anyway, so I really enjoyed applying economics and finance in analyzing companies and analyzing an industry, and understanding and recommending to investors you know what they should be buying or selling, which is what being a sell side research analyst is. You're recommending to investors, you're writing reports, you're publishing, you're marketing to investors what they should buy or sell. But over time, what I realized, and this was maybe 6-7 years into the job, is that I realized that the kind of questions that the investors were asking me, I felt I understood the investment process better than they did. And I felt like I needed to be on that side of the table. It took me 6 or 7 years after, or 5 or 6 years after I decided that, to actually execute on that. There is a certain amount of inertia in making a good living and getting paid well, and getting into a routine which well. But I was clear. You mentioned my clarity about not about wanting to go into MBA and not going into engineering grad school. I was very clear that engineering was not for me. I was also very clear after 6 or 7 years of sell side research that I needed to be on the other side. And it took me a few years to execute on that. But I had a good career. My most memorable 6 years were at a firm called Donaldson Lufkin Generator, or popularly known as DLJ, where there were a lot of smart people, and I learned a great deal. But at the end of the day, it became about selling your ideas to others who would make a decision whether or not to buy them. And you mentioned HCL. I enjoyed, and I had a great time at HCL. I think I did very well, but I realized that sales was not my ultimate calling. It was not intellectually satisfying. And that's why I did 1 year of sales at HCL, and then I went into the MBA. I had the admission to Tulane in 1984 at graduation itself, but I deferred it for a year and then went in a year later uh, and worked for a while because I wasn't sure if I wanted to go, to the U.S. And 1 year working in India and working in sales, I decided that I needed, to broaden my horizons, and sales was not what my final calling was. But in doing that, I did enjoy, you know, learning a lot of, I guess, jugaad, as the term now has become popular, but was popular in HCL even in 1984-85 when PCs first came to India. It was called Busy Bee. HCL was one of the pioneers of that, and we were selling mini computers, and then we moved to the pioneers of the computers coming to India first in 1984. So it was a very unique time to be doing that, and I thoroughly enjoyed the work. But I found somewhat sharp-elbowed. Kind of the culture was not uh, what I needed to stay with for long term. Although I could be very very they encouraged me and they gave me a lot of leeway and recognition for being creative, but it wasn't my final calling. Although I enjoyed that 1 year that I spent there.
So, did your early experiences in some way prepare you for your current profession as an investor and as a person running a hedge fund?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that it's a continuum, uh, uh, and at the end of the day, anything that you do in life is a sum total of all your experiences. So I think that being in sales and being in analysis both help in understanding. At the end of the day, you learn, and I think I've learned from all my experiences, learning human behavior, human interaction, drivers, economic and non-economic factors that drive human behavior, and understanding those better and being able to apply that, and understanding financial analysis. Today, I don't build models, but I built models. So financial models for companies, being able to look at somebody's financial models and understand, what the underlying assumptions are and where the errors may lie in that assumption. Where again, there's the macro level understanding, and then taking it down to the model and understanding where things may be, done wrongly, to be able to understand where the errors may lie, or things may be done wrongly to understand where the errors may be. People are missing the upside opportunity, and therefore, yes, I think that everything that I've done before helps me in doing what I do today.
Arvind, what have been the key challenges that you faced when you established Geosphere Capital, and how did you navigate these challenges? What have been the key milestones reached by Geosphere Capital during this journey? Could you also please tell our viewers more about Geosphere and about what excites you the most about your business?
Well, Geosphere has been an interesting journey. When we started in 2007, we were, one of the hottest launches of the year coming out of SAC, launch of a hedge fund, and we got a lot of investor interest. And in 2008, we were down only 7% when a lot of funds, hedge funds and others were down, 30, 40, 50%. So that was a milestone that caused a lot of investors to flock to Geosphere and, and praise us for our risk management. But, where we faced the challenges in 2009, 10, and 11, the markets went straight up. And I was too cautious because I didn't see the global financial crisis aftermath being as easy, because of the I missed, and I had no background or experience of central bankers printing money and removing all fear from markets and driving economic recovery. And I was listening to the naysayers who were saying this would end badly, because there were people who were saying that bubbles don't last, they end badly. This is very very ill thought out of the central bankers. And that turned out to be a mistake. So a lot of investors were disappointed in us that we didn't take enough risk and left. So we had this big, run, and then we had this big pullback. And it was a humbling experience. And you learn as much from your mistakes as you do from your successes. In fact, I think you learn more from your mistakes than you do from your successes. And what has been challenging is being energy focused. And the other thing that has happened in the last few years is there's this whole wave of ESG, where people want to be, compliant with, environmentally uh, uh, appropriate, environmentally sensitive. And energy is like the tobacco of old. It's become like it's the shunned sector because it's contributing to global warming, or so the thesis goes. And so it's been a challenge. A lot of our competitors have shut down. Uh, we don't have many peers left who are able to manage investing in energy. And frankly, I have diversified my investments. I have an India fund, which is much more diversified, and I'm doing a lot more private equity and venture capital investing. So, in a sense, Geosphere is my public fund, which is still legacy energy and a little bit of India. But a lot of my family office investing, if I can call it that, which is the way in which Geosphere is going to be much more focused on broader themes, which are non just energy focused, whether it is new energy or it is other themes that I see emerging. Uh, and a lot of my interest now is moving towards finding emerging themes in either new energy or in technology. Again, I actually invest through directly entrepreneurs that I like, or with venture capitalists, including a friend of mine from IIT and others, through whom I invest. And then uh, uh, in the investments in the companies that they make, I end up backing some of those companies and putting some more investments on the side. So what Geosphere is transitioning towards is more of a family office. And I don't know if I'll take other people's money, because at some point you get tired of answering to other people and just want to invest for yourself. And so it becomes more of trying to invest for themes that I think can play out over time, because part of also Geosphere, by being an equity long short fund, you're also competing at some point against the quant funds, which are doing the long short. So the long short game has changed dramatically as a result of the quants. So now I'm focusing much more in Geosphere, if I may say. 3.0 is focused much more, my investment career 3.0 is now focused much more on longer term themes that appeal to me, that are not driven by long short, where I'm competing with the quants, or being driven by short term factors, and trying to identify themes beyond the traditional energy and industrials in broader areas, which I don't bring. And one of the things you have to be in our business be very conscious of is knowing what you don't know. And I know I don't know much about a lot of these other sectors, because I've spent a lifetime looking at energy and other related companies. But I understand trends and I understand themes. I understand smart managers. I understand smart investors, and I can piggyback off of smart, venture capitalists or smart managers to find good companies. And then once I find a good company, I can figure out whether I want to invest in those. So those are some of the things that I'm moving towards within the Geosphere umbrella.
Arvind, how recent has been shifting of focus towards becoming a family office?
I'm not formally there, but I think that that's been over the last couple of years.
I understand. Moving over to some broader issues, what are the key challenges faced by the global economy today? Could you please talk about some of the issues faced by some countries such as US, India, Japan, Brazil, China, EU, and the UK? How do we revive or kickstart the global economy under these very trying and testing times?
So I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I'll try to frame it more directly about the economic side. I think clearly, the COVID economic collapse is the biggest economic collapse that we have seen since the Great Depression. It's way beyond the global financial crisis. But the one, challenge here is that I don't think there is a V-shaped recovery uh, because of the fact that as we open up, we're seeing cases continue to rise. And places like Brazil and India, they never stopped falling. But in places like the US, they had fallen and now they're rising again. Europe is seeing similar things. And then when we get into the fall and winter, will we see another round of, flu season is usually very strong in that time in cold countries. And will we now see with the advent of flu season plus everything else going on with COVID, if we don't have a vaccine by then, which I think it'll be imprudent to have a vaccine so quickly, because vaccines require not just clinical trials, but they require clinical trials over a period of time to see what the potential side effects are. And there is no shortcut for human beings other than time to see if there are side effects. So therefore, I think a vaccine is probably not going to be available for broad-based use till early 21. So therefore, I think the economies are going to remain in a stop-start mode. The difference between developed economies, you mentioned a lot of countries, US, Western Europe, Germany, UK, France, major economies there, Japan, I would put this in one bucket, and India, Brazil, developing economies. And China is a unique special situation, so I'll put that in a third bucket, is that in the developed economies, the governments are writing unlimited checks to provide unemployment benefits, payroll benefits, unlimited is probably a strong term, but providing a huge amount of, the US has already done, probably 2.5 trillion, 3 trillion, and is talking about doing another 1 or 2 trillion more. That means on a 20 trillion economy, we're doing about 20% of GDP by the fiscal spending by the government. Plus, you have a similar amount being done by the central bank in terms of money printing. So you have 40% of GDP being done by all of these, entities, and that provides a lot of support to the economy. But I think it leaves a distorted market, distorted economy, distorted incentives, and so you're seeing this bubble. I was in my apartment building in New York. I'm right now not there, but I was at my apartment building in New York 2 weeks ago, and I overheard a doorman telling another doorman about using Robinhood, which is an app which millennials love. This guy's not a millennial, but he's slightly older, but not that old, using it to day trade stocks. So this is the classic sign of a top of a bull market in normal times, when the doorman in my building is using Robinhood to day trade stocks. But because of the amount of money being underwritten by the US Fed and others, this party could go on for a while. But eventually, I think the economic revival will we will slowly recover. We will have a vaccine hopefully by next year, and the economies will recover. But there'll be a lot of businesses that'll go out of business. But capitalism being what it is, the economies will recover. But I think it is going to cause some change in behavior that will be long lasting. Older people will be more cautious. We'll be much more careful about pandemics. Every time we hear about a pandemic, we will freak out. We will be cautious. So things will change. People will get more used to working from home. There'll be less of a desire to hop on an airplane when you can do meetings by Zoom. So there'll be some long-term changes. But economies will revive. I think we will adapt. And online will be a stronger, the big winners are anything online. So that'll be a big winner. That's the economies of the West. But the aging factor that is a factor for Japan, that is a factor for Germany, that is a factor everywhere, is not going to go away. And I think one of US's strengths has been immigration. And right now, under the current government, that has become a negative, and COVID has caused a further backlash against immigration. I think eventually US will have to get back to where to deal with the demographic challenges of low birth rates, immigration of the best and brightest. We talked about, I mentioned Elon Musk earlier. Immigration is going to be an essential component of this, of this trend and this requirement. Developed economies after COVID are still going to face the same challenges they did before, which will be the demographic challenge. But the added challenge will be, dealing with the cleanup of the economy. There'll be a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of business that'll go out of business, and obviously the distortions that the central bank that I talked about in a previous question of sitting on interest rates that might basically steal from savers to help the government pay down its debt. There'll probably be higher taxes. There's a lot of things that we don't know how it'll play out, how this election in the US will play out, whether this move all over the world, there's a global theme playing out. If you go everywhere from Russia to Turkey to Philippines to India to US to Brazil, the common theme is, and even China to some extent, we like right-wing strongmen who are happy to blame outsiders and rally the locals against the outsiders, taking away the opportunities from the locals. That's the common theme. And let me not forget UK and Brexit. This is a common global theme. This is not one politician in one country. This is a global mindset change that has happened in the last 3 or 4 years, almost simultaneously, it seems. I guess maybe Russia and Turkey were early, but the rest of the world, it's only in the last 5, 6 years that this theme has really taken hold. And I don't think that this theme is going to disappear. History will teach us that these themes don't just disappear into the sunset. They end up doing some major structural change and some major structural damage, I would argue. Because the theme that we have lived under for the last 50 years or last 30 years, global consensus, lower government regulation, and more globalization, that theme is being reversed. And the losers from the globalization were people who lost their jobs because somebody in China or India or whatever could do it cheaper. In the West, those were the losers. But it's interesting that even in countries like China and India, which were winners in globalization, there are enough people who convince that somebody else is screwing them why they're not doing better. And nationalism sells well in all of these countries. So I think that the West will probably see more businesses moving closer home, more insourcing, less drugs coming from China, less PPE equipment coming from China. That's the short term. But in general, those themes are reversing. There will be implications for that in terms of maybe higher costs. One of the drivers of deflation globally or low inflation globally was globalization. So as that moves closer home, maybe there'll be more inflation, more earnings power for the locals, maybe more unions. But that removes, some of the benefits that the economy had. So there'll be some reversal of those benefits, but it'll be a reordering of the world order. I think the losers are, China is clearly a loser because the world is going to gang up against China from a economic standpoint, less sourcing from China, more barriers to Chinese businesses. And so it could be a loser, although China sees itself as a winner because it handled COVID well, but that's a very short-term view. In a medium to long term, I think even this border incident with India is going to make India more willing to tie up to the US alliance on a strategic basis, on a defense basis. There's already an informal alliance that'll become stronger. So these are themes that are going to emerge. India could have been a winner from the China sourcing moving away. But I must admit that I'm extremely disappointed that I have not seen structural reform in India, which this crisis, India is going to suffer much more than the West. Emerging markets are going to suffer much more. India, Brazil are going to suffer more because they don't have the ability to write unlimited checks, central bankers to bail out without their currency going for a toss. So they have to be more fiscally disciplined, although they can be a little bit more undisciplined short term because everybody's being undisciplined, but they don't have the financial wherewithal to be able to deal with this. So the economic challenges from this are going to last longer. It doesn't have a well-developed system of dealing with bankruptcies. The bankruptcy law that was passed a few years back basically declared that anybody who went bankrupt basically was a bad guy, was doing something wrong, and can't buy the business back out of bankruptcy. That's the exact opposite of what works in the US. You go bankrupt, you can buy a business. You're the most logical buyer of your own business out of bankruptcy. And the banks will give it to the highest bidder. And usually the highest bidder is a person who knows it well. And it's not seen as some kind of dastardly evil thing to go bankrupt. And so I think one of the challenges for developing countries is going to be a lot of businesses that are going to go out of business because of COVID, because of no fault of their own. Being able to figure out a way to develop a way to let them go bankrupt and come back and run their businesses again and revive those businesses and take a haircut on the debt. That's the way that it should be done. But I'm not sure that the infrastructure exists. So I think countries like India, countries like Brazil are going to have a much tougher time, both on the health challenge front because of having weaker systems, but having younger people in India and having other immunities probably is going to prevent as many deaths, but the economic damage that is being done is going to be more long lasting, is going to be longer to come out of. And you're going to see at least 5 or 10 years of poverty statistic reversal. 5 years, you could set back by that much because of the impact that'll have on the, poor workers, in restaurants or chai walas or whatever. There'll be a lot of damage done that will not be easily reversed because people will be more induced to more often not eat out or be more careful about these things. And some of these things will stay with us for a while. And so the economic damage, I think, is going to be more long lasting. And I think the hope is that, a crisis is, it's been often said, a crisis is too good an opportunity to waste. I'm still hopeful that India will not waste this crisis in terms of taking strategic steps to really welcome global capital to be able to come in and source away from China and use India as one of the sources, because otherwise countries like Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia, as well as Mexico, as well as insourcing and back into the US or into Europe, will be the winners, and Eastern Europe could be a winner. So I think that that's from an economic standpoint, I think the world is going to take probably a couple of years to get back to where we were pre-COVID, but the West could get there faster than that or closer to that. Developing countries could take longer, and India is in a unique position to be able to take advantage of this. But for that, it needs serious strategic thinking. And frankly, one of the things that I worry about is that the Prime Minister Modi, does not have around him the economic and financial brains to be able to help him formulate a strategy that would be world class in terms of being able to take advantage of it.
I understand your concerns, Arvind. You were remembering your professor at Tulane University, who happened to be the son of famous economist Milton Friedman. Which economists have influenced you the most in your thinking?
Well, I would say Milton Friedman would be the most foremost influence in terms of the way of thinking and the way of thinking about the world, and so that makes me more right of center in terms of my economic philosophy as it goes. So more free markets, lower regulation. Those are things that I strongly believe in. Uh, in terms of other economists that I respect in today's day and age, one of them is a acquaintance and a friend, I am very impressed with Raghuram Rajan. But another set of economists that I've been following for a few years because of my involvement in Pratham is uh, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee at MIT, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics uh, just, I guess, 9 months back or so. And they have done some brilliant work on poverty economics, and that's why they won the Nobel Prize in economics. And I've read their book. Uh, uh, I forget it's called Poverty Economics, and basically analyzing using randomized control tests, which is something that is used in medical science, but which has not been used in economic science before, but using randomized control tests to decide which charitable activities, which nonprofits, or which initiatives, not just nonprofits, but which initiatives work for the bottom of the pyramid and which ones don't. And I talked about backing managements and ideas. I think the ideas whose time had already come for me, but now the world is recognizing, is that to help the poor, you have to use the same market principles that we use for anything else in life in economics. And we have to look at what works and what doesn't work. And what Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo have shown in their work is, that the kind of things that work are not necessarily what we think would work. But it was fascinating. I was having a conversation with uh, Professor Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, because he's the founder of Grameen, which is the founder of microfinance in Bangladesh. And we were talking about the Swachh Bharat campaign. And it may surprise many people to know, but I knew about it and I asked him about it, that Bangladesh, which is a poorer country than India, similar culture, has eliminated open defecation by 99%. India still has 40% plus, which exists. And his answer was that it didn't come because of the Bangladeshi government top down trying to do good. It came because of the work that Grameen did at the village level, providing incentives and understanding human nature to create a buy-in by communities to achieve that success. So what I find fascinating is these kind of economists who make a difference at a fundamental level, not just in making money, but in making a difference to the human condition, and being able to then find entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, who can make a difference in changing the way that that the human condition is improved. I'm a strong believer. If you look at the facts, what Reagan and Thatcher did, which was lowering taxes and lowering regulation, China followed or also adopted in '79 under Deng Xiaoping, and U.S. did. I mean, India did in 1990, not on its own volition, but because the World Bank said so. Chile did under Pinochet because he brought the Chicago Boys in and did that. Uh, and I think all the Garibi Hatao slogans achieved very little in removing poverty. Removing restrictions to business, what I call Amiri Bhadao, which was what China did in '79 and what India did in 1990, is what caused entrepreneurs to go out and take risks and to create jobs and to remove poverty. Billions of people moved out of poverty in India and China after Amiri Bhadao by Deng Xiaoping and Amiri Bhadao under Narasimha Rao in China and India, and obviously the rest of the world. Garibi Bhadao and socialism as a slogan economically has failed, yet people keep going back to that in terms of removing poverty. But what I like about what Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee are talking about is using those controlled trials to see what social entrepreneurs do that really works. And one simple example, and again, I'm wandering off in different directions to your question, is that they found that in schools to improve the outcomes, one of the common themes in US inner city schools is that if you only had more money and the poor schools, the kids would do better. What they found is that it was not the funding level at schools that drove improved economic performance. It was giving incentives to teachers if their children's learning outcomes improved. So if the children did better in standardized tests and the teacher got a bonus, if you improve the outcomes, that's when the outcomes of learning improved more than let's raise salaries for everybody so that the teachers will be, so that we'll get, better teachers, better facilities, what have you. So, there are a lot of these little things that I think using economics in solving human conditions like this, that I find fascinating, that are, great interest to me today.
That's very nice to hear, Arvind. Between Keynes and Hayek, would it be fair to say that you are more on the side of Hayek?
Yeah, it would be fair to say that. We're all living in a world where governments are writing unlimited money. So I guess we're practicing some form of uh, Keynes, or what it's called modern monetary theory. But I'm a skeptic that we've come up with this modern monetary theory where we can write unlimited money and it doesn't matter. That's what modern monetary theory says, that the central bankers can take care of it. So it's a post-Keynesian type of thinking, which I'm not a believer in.
So, could you please let our viewers know about Pratham and its activities? And how can rural education change for the better? This is a continuation of your previous comments, especially about Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's experiments.
Yeah, well, so when they won the Nobel Peace Prize, I'm sorry, Economics Prize, they acknowledged that in fact, one of the things that the Nobel Committee said is their work on teaching at the right level was one of the things mentioned by the Nobel Committee in the award. That was one of the pioneering studies that they did. That studies was with Pratham. So in fact, Pratham, they invited the head of Pratham as one of their guests for the Nobel ceremony, and they acknowledged in their press conference how Pratham was one of the most impressive NGOs that they had worked with when they were doing that. So there's a very strong symbiotic relationship between Pratham and JPAL, which is the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which is the group under which those two work at MIT. And I'll tell you something about that JPAL in a bit, which shows how strong that bond is. But but Pratham was established 20 years ago, and it was established actually in Bombay uh, to work in the balwadis, to set up balwadis for in the slums. Balwadis being pre-K schools for kids in the slums in Mumbai, and then they moved to other places. And then they've gone, what Pratham has specialized in is doing things at scale. The problems in India are require scale, huge challenges, right? So Pratham set up educational remedial camps in the slums and then in the villages. But what it did first at scale, at a really scalable level, is they did this thing which I think is about 20 years. I think Pratham, it started about maybe Pratham is 25 and this is 20. I'm forgetting the exact dates, but Pratham started in the early 2000s. They started doing an annual survey in India. uh, I forget, tens of thousands of villages all over India and in the cities, called ASAR, Annual Status of Education Report. And what that survey did was take a simple one page in all the local languages all over India sheet and ask kids to read certain sentences certain words and sentences, and to do certain simple addition, subtraction, uh, mathematical functions. And that survey has become today, a lot of NGOs help out. It's the largest survey of its kind in the world, carried out all over, voluntary survey of its kind. It's obviously not as big as a census, but it's carried out in India. It's carried out in people from Pakistan, people from uh, Southeast Asia, people from African countries. A lot of countries, probably 15 or countries, emerging, developing countries, have adopted it, where it becomes a way to judge each year. And what they found very quickly is that even in the early 2000s, 90% of kids were going to school. So the challenge was not that they were going to school. The challenge was that they were not learning well. That when they were given this survey to fifth standard kids, they were unable to read at even the second standard level. A large number of kids, 50% plus of kids in India. And and again, different states had different standings. And this became such a powerful survey that it changed the discussion in India. This is the power of, so that the governments in their 5-year plans stopped talking about how many kids are in school and started talking about how much kids are learning in school. Because it became less about building schools and making sure everybody is in school, and became more about, are they learning anything when they get to school? Are the teachers teaching them the right thing? Are they able to keep up? So it changed the terms of the debate today. The debate all over the world, and World Bank has adopted it. Uh, uh, a lot of these governments all over the world have adopted it because of Pratham's work to measure learning outcomes and to judge success of their educational spending based on learning outcomes, not counting heads of how many kids are in school. So that's one thing that it did at scale. But the other thing it did at scale, which is what I was referring to, what Abhijit and Esther got the Nobel Economics Prize for, is teaching at the right level. So what it decided is that you had to teach kids not based on which grade or standard they're in, but based on what their learning levels were. So they would hold these remedial camps where they developed this module where they could very quickly get kids who were reading words to read sentences and reading sentences to read paragraphs, and get them very quickly. And then people who couldn't do simple addition, subtraction, to get to start doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and get them up the curve very quickly in a, a 2-week camp they would hold in a village or whatever, or in the school premises after school, uh, or in a slum, maybe in some common hall, you know, in the slum or whatever. They were doing these remedial camps, and they've had enormous success in changing learning outcomes, teaching at the right level. They've also been able to partner with governments. Uh, there was a famous partnership with Punjab government, Bihar government, UP did it for a while, but the governments change, and then some governments give up, or some politician or some bureaucrat decides we don't need Pratham, we can do it ourselves. But what they've done is give remedial training to the teachers to be able to deal with, because what ends up happening in a classroom is the teacher is teaching to the front of the class who's understanding what they're saying, and the back of the class which is not following, which is falling behind, they're just ignoring, because there's no other choice in these rural schools or slum schools, because there's a large crowd of kids and some of whom are not able to keep up. So they've been able to teach them to teach at the right level so that they're able to fix the, rather than giving up on the kids who are falling behind, how to teach them at their level to get them up. And therefore, it has affected tens of millions of kids in India. And JPAL has been so impressed with Pratham that the story goes like this. Pratham, also the Asar went to Africa, but the government of Zambia came to JPAL and said, JPAL had been invited to do some survey of the schools in Zambia. They said, you've told us about this teaching at a right level. We don't have the ability to do it. Why don't you, JPAL, come and do it for us. Now, JPAL is a measurement organization focused on measurement, not on implementation. They came to Pratham and said, we've been asked by the government of Zambia to do this. We can't do it on our own. Will you come with us, Pratham? Today, Pratham is in 10 countries in Africa, from Zambia to Kenya, Nigeria. Nigeria, they went to the state where Boko Haram is there. So it's the most dangerous state. Uh, Cote d'Ivoire, Botswana, I forget all the countries, 10 countries in Africa. JPAL and Pratham have a partnership where they are implementing teaching at the right level. And Pratham is not sending loads of teachers or anything. It has just sent 8 people, 6 or 7 of them are women, who have gone to Africa, and they're teaching the teachers there in each of these countries how to teach, or teaching the trainers who train the teachers, so whatever the infrastructure is, to teach at the right level and to transform the learning outcomes there. So this is, we talk about Indian companies that go multinational, Indian entrepreneurs. Here's a social entrepreneur that has gone multinational, that is making a difference on a global scale. My involvement with Pratham is because I wanted to make a difference in India. But what I'm proud about is that the world is recognizing how uniquely simple and yet powerful their capability is. And therefore, their Asar was adopted all over the world. And now their teaching at the right level is being adopted in other countries. And again, when I'm looking at anything that is involved in donating my money or my time, I'm looking for the same metrics that I use in my investment, the quality of the entrepreneur and the ability to make a difference in the way that they're saying. Because there are a lot of good people who start schools, who there was one guy who's a hedge fund manager in California who started this school that takes poor kids and helps them pass IIT entrance exams and get in and do well. And I think that's an admirable thing, to take poor kids and help them get into IIT, because that transforms their life and it transforms lives of others. Uh, and I'm sure he's trying to do it at a large scale, but Pratham is doing it at a much larger scale. And to me, education is the most powerful tool that you can bring to human beings to make a difference to their life.
It is very impressive to learn about the activities of Pratham and the impact that it has made. And I was also not aware of the links that Pratham has with the JPAL group in MIT and with the research of Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo. So this is, an important learning for me as part of this conversation. So could you also speak about the Alexander Hamilton Society and your experiences as member of the board?
Sure. Well, Alexander Hamilton was more or less a forgotten figure in the US when I joined Alexander Hamilton Society about 7 or 8 years ago. And suddenly, when the Hamilton musical came out, Alexander Hamilton became. So the $10 bill has an Alexander Hamilton picture. He was the first Treasury Secretary. But they were talking about replacing Alexander Hamilton with somebody else more, politically correct, a woman or whatever. And after the Hamilton musical came out, nobody's talking about replacing Alexander Hamilton. They're talking about other bills, because he was, the first kind of, financial thinker in the U.S. who kind of set up the, the first Treasury Secretary, and I think the precursor to the current federal system, the bank in New York, whatever that he lived in, and that was all done. And in fact, one of the history lessons goes that to prevent him from becoming the president is why some of the people who didn't like Alexander Hamilton put in place in the U.S. Constitution that only a person who's born in the U.S. can be president of the U.S., which was because Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean. He was not born in the U.S. But anyway, so the Alexander Hamilton Society was founded by some professors and some other supporters, and I joined it within a couple of years of it founding, to bring to college campuses an understanding of the importance of America's role in staying engaged in the world. This predated Trump coming to power, and it basically wanted to bring to campuses an appreciation for the fact that America has been played an important role in the positive development of the world. Because one of the things that has happened on college, so it is identified, I guess, by some as a right-wing organization, because college campuses have become places dominated. There's been surveys done which show that 70-80% of college professors probably think that socialism is a great idea. If you went back into the 1930s and 40s, probably the biggest support for communism in the US and the belief that communism was eventually a better system than capitalism and Soviet Union was going to win would have been found on college campuses. So college campuses have become this hotbed of this view that America is done all bad and capitalism is bad and all of these things, and we need to be apologetic for it, not recognizing that after World War II, if it were not for America, it is the first time in history that a winner spent significant money on the losers, Germany and Japan, to build them up to where their competitors today that were in some areas eating America's lunch, and America never tried to hold them back in that. And with NATO and other formers, helped defeat the Soviet Union and the forces of what I would call evil, which was the communist takeover Eastern Europe. If you go to Eastern Europe, they're forever grateful that the U.S. and others stood up to the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. So my point about Alexander Hamilton is it's to bring people on campus to hold debates and discussions where professors from their colleges can debate with people that Alexander Hamilton brings to campus to discuss issues of the day. And it's ironic that today, even a Trump is a isolationist, and we believe that global engagement, globalization, uh, America's continued involvement, free markets, uh, immigration are all important principles to be defended on college campuses. And so Alexander Hamilton Society has chapters in about 40 or 50 colleges, and these are all student-run chapters. And they all have to have maybe a professor as a mentor, advisor is required, and these are private clubs or groups on campuses. And Alexander Hamilton provides, the society provides resources to bring speakers on campus and to provide internships for students if they want to come to Washington. Most of these people are political science students. These are not your engineers and your business school students. These are mostly uh, politically engaged students who are looking for an alternative viewpoint on campus to the completely, I would say, dominant view on campus, which is extremely left of center on all college campuses in the US.
That's very interesting to know. Arvind, greetings and advance birthday wishes on your 60th birthday, which is on 15th July.
That's right. Thank you. Just
How
about
do you feel on
almost 2
attaining
weeks.
this important milestone?
Oh, ancient. 60 when I would have thought about 60 when I was growing up, it would be like my Nanaji or my Dadaji. So I guess I'm at the Nanaji Dadaji stage, although my kids are not old enough yet to have made me a grandfather yet. But it does make me feel ancient. And I think the one thing that I try to keep in mind is that I may be one of the things I want to guard against is talking about the good old days. One of the things I remember my elders talking about is the good old days. I think the thing that keeps, I think, me young is that sense of adventure and knowing that There's always going to be a new good old day and a new uh, good old days to reminisce about in the past. But we have to live in the present and prepare for the future and be prepared for new challenges. And as long as our mind is young, hopefully, and knock on wood, at 60, I've had my health challenges, as we all do as we get older in life, but I still feel healthy and young and as fit as I've ever been in terms of physical fitness, which I try to keep mindful of. And so, I'm grateful for the 60 years, but I'm not ready to retire yet, and reminisce about the good old days.
So I'm happy to hear that you feel healthy and young, and this important milestone. So,
Thank
so
you.
that's really great. Arvind, I have spoken to a lot of your friends from Hostel 6, and all of your friends think very highly of you. And all of us from H6 and IIT Bombay are very deeply inspired by your success. And
Thank you.
this discussion with you has been a very interesting one, where I have actually learned a lot of interesting things about your journey and also about Geosphere and Pratham. And so it's been very, very interesting. And the other interesting thing is about the timing of the discussion because it is past midnight in India. So it almost seems like a midnight CAC session that we would have, during our days at IIT. That's the reason why it is all the more nostalgic for me. So
Thank you.
it has really been wonderful speaking with you, Arvind. So thanks a lot, and wishing you the very best on your 60th birthday and beyond. Thanks a lot for spending the time on this timeless series today.
Thank you, Vivek, for doing this, and I enjoyed it.
So thanks a lot, Arvind.